conversations have really begun. And so we were really encouraged to hear that you all are interested in finding out more about what's happening. And Sevdelina has just done a fantastic job in briefing us on some of your interests and how we can be helpful to you. That's really what we're here for. And so to just go right into it, as she said, I think what we'll do today is go over the process where we are right now, some of the issues that are involved, the challenges as we see it, being observers very, very close here to the UN. The UN Foundation plays a role as sort of having one foot in the UN and one foot out. And so I think we play a very good brokering role in understanding who the major actors are, what the key challenges are, and how we can move forward. And so hopefully we can share some of that insight with you today. And then lastly, just would love to engage in a conversation with you about what your interests are and the role of the foundations and how we can move forward together. So to start, I think just to say, the post-2015 agenda, I think a lot of the energy that's around it is in large part because of the success of the Millennium Development Goals. People largely saw the MDGs as being the crowning achievement for the UN in 2000 when member states agreed to the Millennium Declaration and then set forward a set of 8 goals and targets on how we might, as a global community, address global poverty issues. This time around, I think the excitement around the MDGs, or the post-2015 agenda, is largely based on the fact that the MDGs were seen as very effective in galvanizing public opinion, in steering donor aid and implementation activities and delivery on the ground, and really making a difference in people's lives. As you all probably know the kinds of outcomes that have come out of that. And so I'd say there's sort of 3 main things that are at stake this time around. First is sort of multilateralism and the idea of international cooperation to solve global problems. I think in recent years what we've seen is that people are actually a little bit skeptical as to whether global agreements can help to solve global problems, whether countries can get together and agree on priorities and what they'll do about it. So sort of crisis of confidence in multilateralism, I think, is first one of the main issues at stake. Second is the development impact. Can this agenda be as impactful as the Millennium Development Goals were? Can it really make a difference in people's lives developmentally in developing countries and elsewhere? And then lastly, the environmental impacts. Can we take on activities that we need to mitigate some of the environmental damages that have happened, climate change, et cetera? And so those are sort of broadly, I'd say, the 3 main issues that are the reasons why we really care about post-2015. So can you all see that that slide has changed? I don't think really like it. Do you want to make it big?
It looks like yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, I just want to make sure that if I'm changing it, you all can. Okay, great. So broadly speaking, I'd say there are 4 potential outcomes at the end of this process. The first is that we continue with the same set of MDGs as we did last time, but on a longer timeline. I think this is now not really an option anymore. The conversation has largely changed, but at some point people were suspecting that if we don't actually get a bold and new outcome that includes the number of new issues that we think it should, then we may just fall back to continuing with the MDGs on a longer time frame. Second potential outcome is adding or modifying the current goals, a sort of an MDGs plus agenda, which would include absolute targets, a sort of getting to zero approach. It may add a few additional targets or goals, and maybe add issues of quality along with access. Third, we could have a potentially completely different framework, and this is where the conversation is currently, where we have a new framework with goals and targets as before, but that it includes environmental and economic issues and other global priorities such as rule of law and institutions and governance, as well as maybe even addressing some of the climate challenges that we face. A new framework could also look at interlinkages between the issues, as well as be universally applied to all countries, although taking into account the fact that countries are in different parts of the development spectrum, so the sort of national differentiation. And then lastly, and this is the train wreck scenario, that we don't get a global agreement at all due to lack of agreement or an ineffective process, or the geopolitics, which I think is really the major problem here. Or that we get a really weak and unfocused document that includes so many issues, but not in any meaningful and actionable way, that's not measurable and targeted. And so you sort of get a Christmas tree, and that's my graphic down there. So I'd say that no framework or an exceptionally weak agreement is, in a sense, a train wreck scenario. So that last one we really want to try to avoid. And so we'll talk a little bit today about the challenges there and how we try to avoid that framework. So what are the components of the post-2015 conversation now? What is the post-2015 development agenda? I'd say it's made up of 3 components. First are the goals and targets themselves, what people are calling the Sustainable Development Goals. And that is where most of the conversation is. What is a goal? What will be a target? Are my issues going to become goals? Second, the financing or the means of implementation, and this includes financing, it includes global technology transfers, cooperation between countries, the sort of how of development. And then lastly, monitoring and accountability. So how will we make sure that the commitments that we sign up to are monitored, are measured, and are then we're held accountable to the outcomes that we say that we're going to try to achieve? And so in that, there are different processes that are involved. On the first, under goals and targets, all of you are probably aware of the high-level panel last year proposing a set of goals and targets as well as a narrative around that. The open working group right now is mandated by Rio Plus 20 to try to develop the set of goals and targets among the group of 70 countries that are members, but it's actually largely countries across the board. The financing and means of implementation, there are several conversations about how we finance this that will culminate in the Financing for Development conference next July. And then lastly, on monitoring and accountability, there's a process in the UN under the high-level political forum that will then address monitoring and accountability issues. So what does this process actually look like? This is our graphic to try to condense it a little bit, although it's still somewhat complicated. But just to say, the pink in the middle is the Secretary General's process. So those things that he has undertaken himself under his authority, which includes the high-level panel, the report that he developed last September, and then his synthesis report that will be coming this fall. The green is the member state-driven process that's mostly coming out of Rio Plus 20. So that includes the open working group that's developing the Sustainable Development Goals and the report that they will have with the goals, and we can get to that a little bit later. The Expert Committee on Financing, so the technical recommendations on how we finance this agenda. The high-level political forum, as I mentioned, which will bring in the accountability side of it. And then at the bottom there you'll see in the gray, these are all of the consultations that are happening outside the UN, including the global conversation that the UN development system has put in place across countries and on various themes. In the purple you'll see the climate negotiations, which is a separate process, but that's going to be influencing this. And then at the very bottom there, all of the civil society groups, private sector, expert think tanks and foundations that are also trying to feed into the conversation too. And all of this will culminate into the yellow here on the member state negotiations. So this September, after the open working group develops its goals and targets, we have a report on financing. The Secretary General then will take those inputs and put them into what we call a synthesis report. And that will then be the basis for the member state negotiations that start this fall. And then those negotiations will lead into a final summit next September, where we hope then the entire post-2015 development agenda, including goals and targets, financing, as well as accountability, will be adopted. And Mara, if there's anything that I'm missing, please chime in. Sure. So what are the key challenges to this outcome? As we see it, there are 3 broad buckets. The first is the breadth of the issues. The second is the universal applicability for this agenda. And the third is the geopolitics. On the first, in terms of the breadth of the issues, as you all know, the Millennium Development Goals were focused on the poorest. So how do we make development outcomes for the poorest better? This time around, they're looking at not just development outcomes, but environmental issues as well, on how we reach the hardest to reach and the marginalized, including women, the disabled, indigenous groups, how we also deal with poverty in conflict-affected and fragile states, as well as integrating the issues around rule of law, peaceful societies, and governance. So the breadth of the issues is much broader, and so there are a lot more issues involved, and I think with it, a lot more controversy in terms of this not just being a social agenda, a poverty-focused agenda. Second, on universality. So as I said, the MDGs, as you all know, was focused mostly on the poor, and this time around, because the development landscape and the geopolitical landscape has changed, there is a general agreement that this development agenda will apply to all countries. So the United States to South Sudan to Rwanda and countries in Asia alike. So all countries will have to take on responsibility, including for their own development outcomes and then helping others as well. So some of the issues involved, what are countries going to be willing to put on the table? What kinds of limits will they accept themselves in terms of consumption and finance and the rules of the game that they'll have to take into account? Lastly, under geopolitics, this is very difficult. Obviously, things have changed quite dramatically across the globe since 2000. We've had the financial crisis. We have emerging economies and the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa becoming very, very prominent on the world stage. And so the geopolitics of this are quite different. And this isn't just a north-south issue anymore. That I think high-income countries are aware of the differing development landscape. They're aware of their own constraints in being able to contribute to development. The capacity of African and least developed countries to participate in the discussions and the issues that are really at stake for them with climate. Obviously, they're going to be the ones hardest hit. On poverty, they still have a lot to deal with, but they also, in terms of in the negotiating environment, they have a lot less diplomatic capacity to argue on their own behalf. And so I think that complicates the situation. For middle-income countries, and especially the BRICS, it's difficult to see what's really in it for them. In the past, if this has been a north-south agenda with donors contributing aid to recipients and recipients then having to implement and take on some responsibilities, in this agenda then, what is really in it for the BRICS? And I think you'll see for some of them a somewhat defensive position of not wanting to be the new donors in any official capacity, and that they still have large populations of poor in their countries. And so how do we help deal with persistent poverty and those pockets of poor? So I think the geopolitics of this are very difficult, and issues relating to trade and finance and ODA, et cetera, are really coming to the fore now. I'd say that if you were to look into the crystal ball, this last one, the geopolitics, will be the main one that this agreement hinges on. So on the goals and targets, what are we actually looking at? I'm going to hand it over to my colleague to talk through with you the latest revision, which was just out late last night, of the Open Working Group set of goals and targets. And they're looking at 17 at this point. So I'm going to hand it over to Mara to discuss that.
Great. Thank you, Mintu. So as Mintu mentioned, this revised draft just came out last night. So our timing for this webinar, I think, could not be better because this is very fresh. This is the latest from the Open Working Group drawing on their June session that just passed. And so, as Mintu said, they're working currently with 16 goals, which is obviously a lot broader and longer than the current or the 8 goals that are in the MDGs. So there's a lot of talk about how that will be whittled down over the next year, and whether the Open Working Group will be able to do that, or whether that will sort of have to wait until the member state negotiations over the next year. So just to get a sense of what's in currently, I'll run through these and also give a sense of what's more or less controversial, just as it may affect your issue. So I would say that the first About 7 are pretty non-controversial with a few exceptions, and that's because they mostly cover the core existing MDGs, and so the argument for including them is pretty clear. So ending poverty everywhere is probably the least controversial, and I think everyone recognizes that the underlying goal of this agenda is to end extreme poverty. The next few on ending hunger, attaining healthy lives, and education are all, very likely to be goals. There are nuances about how to frame the health goal and, what are the right targets under education, but as far as the issues themselves, they will be in. Then you have attaining gender equality, empowering women and girls everywhere. This one is also non-controversial, except that there are a lot of advocates who would like to see strong language on sexual reproductive health and rights, and that is still quite controversial, especially as many countries cite religious and cultural differences about how to define that and where the boundaries are versus cultural norms and sort of international norms. So that is, SRHR is one thing that we would flag as controversial. The next one on sustainable use of water and sanitation, I would say relatively non-controversial. Same for sustainable energy for all. People have actually pointed to that as a model for a sustainable development goal because it covers equally development and sustainability. With one exception, many have called for targets on fossil fuel subsidies, but as you can imagine, this is quite controversial among many of the oil-producing countries. So that is one target that I would say is vulnerable. Then we have goals that sort of go beyond the MDGs. The next two focus more on economic growth and employment, as well as infrastructure and industrialization. And this is sort of getting at the, when people talk about the 3 dimensions of sustainability, this is the economic side of it, recognizing that if you really want sustainable development, you need to look at the underlying factors of economic growth, employment, industrialization, etc. Current goal number 10, inequality, is actually quite controversial. Many people realize and recognize that this should be addressed and that it was one of the gaps with the MDGs, but it's controversial as to whether or not it deserves its own goal or whether inequality should just be embedded throughout the agenda and taken into account into the targets under other goals. Sustainable cities is not that controversial, but some say that it may not need its own goal and could also be taken up under another goal area. Sustainable consumption and production patterns, goal 12, is quite controversial because this gets at one of the issues Mintu mentioned before of historic responsibilities, what countries are paying for what, and who's responsible for what. But we can talk about that a little bit more later. Goal 13 is probably the most controversial, if not one of the most. That is climate change. So there's a lot of controversy over whether or not climate should have its own goal. Everyone, again, recognizes that it's very important, but that it's also being taken up in this simultaneous process in the UNFCCC, and so will that sort of have an overlapping mandate, or do the SDGs need to recognize climate in order to be relevant in the next 30 years? The next two on oceans and ecosystems, I would say are also not as controversial, but there has been talk about merging the two into one because of, again, just needing to whittle down this number. So that is something that we might see over the next couple of months. And then the final two, I would say, are probably the other most controversial ones. So peaceful societies, access to justice for all, and effective and capable institutions. There's a lot in there. Some people feel that peace is the bedrock for development and that you can't have development without peace, and so there's a strong case there, but others say that it impedes on national sovereignty, it's beyond the mandate of the Rio +20 outcome, and that focusing on peaceful societies may take some of the focus away from the extreme poverty issues in least developed countries. And then embedded in this is another potential goal on sort of the governance, rule of law, and institutions issue, which I would say is less controversial than the peaceful societies, but still not guaranteed. And then last but not least is the means of implementation and global partnership. Many call this the make or break issue for the entire agenda, because this is all about who's paying for what, how are countries cooperating with one another, how is this agenda going to become real and implemented on the ground. And it's where a lot of the sort of trust and accountability issues come in. So this will probably be the biggest one, and if we can get this right, I think the rest will fall into place.
Great, thanks, Mara. So then, as Mara mentioned, just to review, what are the major fault lines? As she said, you know, I put them into sort of three main buckets. Means of implementation, which is essentially the how of this. Who's going to pay for what, and who will be responsible for paying. Because environmental and climate issues are being involved, there's a sort of polluter pays sense among countries that developed countries that have had the freedom to sort of develop their economies as they can at the expense of the environment should place more limits on themselves and should pay more in this. Obviously, there are limits to ODA. Estimates are that this agenda will be in the upwards of $1 trillion a year, and so no matter how much ODA there is, no matter whether countries like the U.S. and others uphold their 0.7% commitments, that will have enough to pay for this agenda, and so we really do have to look at other means, including private sector financing, innovative financing, natural resources management, illicit tax flows, et cetera, other ways for doing this. So the means of implementation, incredibly controversial. Second, I put this sort of bucket of climate as well as sustainable consumption and production. And again, it's sort of who's responsible for what kinds of limits are we willing to place on ourselves. And then lastly, the peaceful societies, rule of law, and institutions bucket. Incredibly controversial for the reasons that Mara just mentioned. Sovereignty, some countries are afraid that if they accept these issues as goals or targets, that then they'll have conditionalities placed on their aid, various other challenges there. I suspect that on this last one, countries that are against including this are okay with some of the targets, but are not willing to have peaceful societies and rule of law and institutions as a goal. And I think that's the case for the climate and sustainable consumption and production as well. Will climate be a goal, or will it just be integrated in climate-smart targets across the agenda? One of the main issues that you'll find that's kind of overriding all of this is the idea of common but differentiated responsibilities, which is language that's largely come out of the climate negotiations about specific countries being responsible for funding and placing limits on development. So I think there are, though, some moments of optimism. Oh, let me go back. So I think there are, though, despite these fault lines, there are some bits of optimism. And I think also a role for foundations here. There is a call for a data revolution for us to better collect information to measure and also disaggregate data so we know what's happening with different populations. There is really a big need for the right kinds of research and evidence to show what works. What are the areas that if we were to focus on could really make a difference developmentally and environmentally? I think data, this drive suddenly, you know, statisticians and people working on data are the most popular people in this agenda right now, so I think that's just a positive thing for us. It's something that I know that many foundations are very interested in. The second is, you know, there is a sense that with so many people and so much energy working on this agenda, that it really is because this will align our work going forward. So globally, at the global level, at the national level, at the local level, how do we use this agenda to really align everyone's priorities around a common set of issues? Thirdly, I'd say there is an understanding among the member states here that all eyes are on them, that the UN's credibility is at stake, and that they really do need to prove that countries can get together and solve problems together. We could talk a little bit more about the role of foundations if you'd like. I'm sure you all have questions, so I'll leave it there. Fundamentally, I think if we look at multilateralism, the development impact, the environmental impact of this agenda, and what we can really hope for. This is about setting priorities for the world that we want for the next generation and for future generations. And I think really trying to instill a sense of renewed responsibility among countries is important here. I think, you know, a lot of the fighting will be about who's responsible for what, and who will get more out of this agenda. And at the end of the day, this is about how we work together to get there. So open to questions and to delving a little bit more into this with you all. Thank you.
Thank you both very much for this incredibly rich presentation. I know the process is very complex, the content is incredibly complex as well, and you were able to lay it out in a relatively simple and clear manner, and I hope the participants will agree with that. Perhaps if I could use my position as the moderator and come back to you on one or two points you raised. Can you tell us a little bit more about the universality? I think this is one of the issues I have come to appreciate, that it is not fully understood what this could mean. And I think it is particularly relevant to foundations, knowing that the majority of foundations around the world actually work in their local context, at best at the national level. So they're not necessarily working across borders in developing countries and so on. So if you could explain a little bit more, if this really goes through and gets the buy-in, what does this mean and what it would mean for a foundation?
Yeah, thanks so much. Great question. I think right now the countries themselves are struggling with what it actually means. You know, we've held several meetings with countries as a group and even individually, trying to delve a little bit more to understand what they mean by universality. And I think at one point it was more around the idea was proposed because they saw that the development landscape has changed and that this isn't just about North or South, and that responsibilities for development outcomes shouldn't just be on the shoulders of developing countries. So I think it was somewhat controversial to have this being a universal agenda, meaning applying the goals and targets to all countries, and now it's just part of the conversation. They are still figuring out what that means. We had some researchers in the U.S. take on board the goals and targets that were proposed in the high-level panel report and apply it to the U.S. context, so that if you were to look at poverty in the U.S., we may not be looking at $1.25 a day poverty, but there is a national poverty line. And so if you try to get everybody above the U.S. defined national poverty line, what does that look like? Do we have the data out there? Yes, the U.S. is a data-rich place. And then what does it take to get there? The same on educational outcomes or health outcomes. And so I think in the U.S. context, which is a data-rich sort of environment, it's a little bit easier to see how some of these goals and targets would be applied. One of the challenges is how do you have universally defined goals that are applicable to very, very different national contexts. And so I think part of the conversation is, will the targets look different in a place like the U.S. or in Europe than they will in countries in sub-Saharan Africa or parts of Asia? And I think the countries haven't quite fleshed out what the differences in the targets would look like. They're still working on that right now, and I think there's still going to be quite a bit more. Again, some of this will be based on just what data do we have and what kinds of indicators can we collect. And so I think the role of foundations there is really important. But if foundations that are working in their domestic contexts take a look at the goals and targets as they are now, the draft, and just think about if you were to apply that to the country that you work in, what would that mean? And then what would be the delivery mechanisms? How do we implement that? Is one way to do it. And again, I think they are still right now figuring out what the differences in the targets would look like from country to country. So we don't know exactly, but we do know that if countries sign on to this, they will all agree to taking on these responsibilities themselves.
Thank you very much. I got another question here. What concretely can foundations do in order to yield tangible results once the final framework is established?
Yeah, great question. I think, with the goals and targets, there's such a range of issues, and I see that a lot of the foundations that are on the call today work on many of the issues that are involved in post-2015 agenda. I think the next phase of this will be to look at implementation. So around some of the individual goals and targets, what is the community of foundations, governments, civil society groups, and others, experts, around each of the targets, and then what is going to be their role? I think that needs to be defined. But from the outset, if a foundation is working in an area and you see a goal there, I would say, help to figure out what the right way to implement it is. For some of the issues, we've already, we do have a good sense on the poverty and social issues. I think we do have a good sense, and the work that's already being done, I think, should continue. In others, I think we'll have to have people step up and say and contribute to the implementation. I think on the research side and evidence side, that is really critical, and I do see that being a role for some foundations. What are the critical projects and programs that really work in addressing some of these issues? So, this agenda is about outcomes. Are there certain programs or approaches to a problem that really make a difference? And then is there the evidence that shows how those programs can make a difference? If foundations can help contribute that, I think we can develop a better implementation plan around some of these targets and goals.
Thank you very much. Another question that has come through. What about South-to-South support and how to monitor quality versus quantity in achieving objectives from Ringbank End?
Okay.
I didn't hear the last part of the question. How to...
What about South-to-South support and how to monitor quality versus quantity in achieving objectives?
Okay, thanks. So that's a really good question, and sort of one of the new challenges with this agenda, where we're not just looking at the typical donor-recipient relationships. And there's a lot of talk among the emerging countries, the BRICS, Latin American countries especially, who sort of feel torn between playing this dual role of, they're still receiving some aid, but then they're also providing assistance to other southern countries and neighboring countries, because that helps their whole region. And actually, that's a very interesting question, because they don't want it to be measured, they don't want it to be quantified as aid per se. They really want it to be seen as providing technical cooperation. So whether that is sending an expert in country to carry out a project or provide advice, or facilitating technology transfers among countries and innovations. So these are sort of the types of South-South cooperation that they're talking about, which is really about transfer of ideas, technology, rather than the aid. And they're actually quite adamant about not focusing so much on trying to measure it and trying to live up to certain commitments, but really to just have it be more about helping one's neighbor in a region and recognizing that you're not just doing this for the sake of your aid measurement, but really to be in the spirit of cooperation and the spirit of regional stability. So I think the quality versus quantity point is very relevant in terms of South-South cooperation.
Thank you very much. Avil Kilmurray is asking, how can we ensure the active participation of those communities that are most excluded and deprived in both the country-specific design, implementation, and monitoring of measure impact on an ongoing basis?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's a real challenge right now. In terms of the creation of the goals and targets and the whole agenda, the UN has tried to reach out to as many people as possible through its national level consultations. I think it's held 100 meetings in 100 different countries to try to bring in civil society. Whether they're reaching the most marginalized, I think, is another question. They've also put they've also started a survey called My World. You can go to myworld2015.org, and people are able to kind of fill in what are their key issues that they want addressed in this agenda. And they've also, for some governments like Nigeria and Cameroon and others, have taken those as written ballots to villages and communities and had people fill that out and then input that information back in there, so you can see country by country what what people are saying. But in terms of the implementation side and being able to know on a real-time basis how vulnerable communities are doing, I think that's a really difficult challenge. I mentioned the data revolution earlier. Some folks are trying to make sure that we can collect data in a disaggregated way so that we can see how segments of the population are doing. And obviously, you can have a greater impact if you know what you're measuring and you're paying attention to various populations in that way. But I think the challenge is just what's the capacity for being able to collect that data. And so, some people are working on that. I think that's going to be a huge gap. The reason why we're calling this the data revolution is because you really do need a revolution to get to understanding the scope of the problem and being able to tackle those communities that are most vulnerable.
I can add one thing to that, which goes along with the data revolution idea, but in the high-level panel report that came out last summer, probably the most revolutionary idea in it, a lot of people say, is this idea of leaving no one behind. And the reasoning behind that is that when you look at the goals and targets, they would not consider a target to be met unless it was met for all segments of the population, including the most vulnerable. So in that way, they tried to instill that into the entire agenda by saying that the way we're measuring this is that you're not making progress on a target unless you've reached all populations. And I think that that was an idea that has been taken forward in the Open Working Group, and that member states are thinking about how to make that real. And as Mintu said, I think the data revolution is one of those ways.
Thank you. Just a quick follow-on on that. As a matter of fact, in some of the conversations I have been following around these issues, the question was raised whether and how one can embed mechanisms that really allow for grassroots innovations, solutions, to actively inform program design and policy development. And at the moment there appears to be, in reality, in most places, a disconnect for that feedback loop. So I guess that would be one of the big challenges, to figure out how to make it work.
Yeah, I think that's right. People have talked about using mobile data and big data that's collected to figure out where, how populations are doing, and then trying to use that as a feedback loop. I think there's some innovative and interesting projects that are out there to try to do that. But obviously, those will need to be scaled up and then brought into the global decision-making process too.
And that might be one role for foundations, is to help bridge that gap between the grassroots and the government level. Since foundations tend to be somewhere in between and have access to both groups, that might be an interesting project to think about, is how to connect those organizations that want to get to that policy level and sort of play a bridging role.
I wanted to follow up on one other issue you raised. Towards the end of the presentation, I think there is a bit of an echo. Towards the end of the presentation, you said that the last proposed goal on the global partnership is potentially kind of the make it or break it, figuring out how these relationships and roles and responsibilities would work out. Can you give us example of some of the discourse currently underway of what the nature of these relationships would look like, or what kind of new ways of working together may be emerging in the coming period, in the future?
Thanks for that question. The conversations in New York are not very, on that, unfortunately, are not very sophisticated, if I can be very frank. It's mostly around trying to get donor countries to live up to their ODA commitments, and then for developing countries and especially emerging economies to understand that they also have a role to play in contributing to the global partnership. In terms of what the new development paradigm looks like, that conversation isn't very robust. It a lot of times feels like a sort of finger-pointing game of who's going to be responsible and who's going to pay. And I think there's going to be some interesting conversations over the next few months as we lead up to the Financing for Development Conference in Ethiopia in July of 2015, as countries begin to see what really they can bring to the table there in terms of financing, leveraging public financing, leveraging private capital through public financing, and seeing what the role of others can be in this. But the conversation isn't very sophisticated right now. It's mostly related to what can you bring to the table: aid, technology transfers, changing trade rules and regulations, allowing developing countries and emerging economies to have a bigger seat at the table at the international financial institutions or the G20 or the UN and those kinds of questions. I think it's the anxiety that's coming out of this, the fact that the global landscape looks very different, and we still haven't figured out then how we adapt ourselves and our institutions to that environment. I'm sorry I don't have a very satisfactory answer, but it's a great question. If anyone has some good ideas, please let us know.
Well, this is already helpful to start with, because foundations are often asked to basically stand up or come forward, and what is not at all clear is how this can all happen in a way that is respectful and also meaningful from the perspective of the different type of assets, knowledge, expertise different actors can bring together. I have a couple of other questions coming through. Are foundations mainly looked upon as funders, or is there a forum where new financial instruments can be discussed, like social impact bonds?
Great, thank you. Great question. Within the negotiations right now, foundations are largely looked down as funders. I get that sense often, even though we play a slightly different role here in New York. We're not just a grantor or a funder. And I think that's largely because the conversations are not that sophisticated. I mean, essentially what you have are diplomats, from their foreign ministries trying to negotiate an agreement. They're not from their finance ministries. They're not people who are, coming from private sector backgrounds or backgrounds with a lot of knowledge and other things. And also, a lot of these folks are following a whole range of issues, and so they're not really expert in any one area, and so don't maybe know the kind of universe of options there, or even the role that foundations can play other than being a funder. But in terms of forums for a discussion on other financial instruments, as I said, the Financing for Development conversations next July, I think many people are hoping that some of the other ways to fund this will be discussed. There's an expert group or an expert committee on financing that's developing a report now that will look at all of the different ways we can approach financing this agenda. I am told that they are looking at social impact bonds and other ways, but I don't know. Some of that may be subject to the political process here, even though it's supposed to be a technical group. So we'll see. But in terms of having that really be a part of the conversation, I think one of the gaps is just a lack of understanding about how that works and what the issues that are involved. And so one of the things that we do, and I probably should have started by saying, talking a little bit about the role of the UN Foundation, one of the things that we do is to try to address the information asymmetry here. There are a lot of missions that are very small. There's one person who covers everything on development, including post-2015, but all the other issues as well. And so we try to hold meetings to brief them on the issues, including on various aspects of financing. And that social impact bonds and other issues have come up, but we do see that there is a real gap in just being able to absorb it and understand it to the extent that they can then bring that into the negotiations. I have high hopes for the Financing for Development Conference, but I think if foundations have, if there's some lessons from that or some good policies that can be proposed in this setting, maybe someone can put together a nice policy brief that then, groups like ours can try to input into the negotiations here.
Thank you very much. This is actually very helpful and is connected to what I wanted to follow up with. What do you see as a few entry points for foundations to get involved, for example, between now and 2015 to start with, before we start looking into the longer term?
Yeah. Well, the conversations in New York have been going on for quite some time. The Open Working Group is essentially a committee of the UN, and they are almost finished with developing the goals and targets. And so in terms of foundations having a say in what the goals and targets look like, I think that could be somewhat difficult, although the door isn't closed. As I said, that's just one committee, and then it needs to go to the rest of the UN membership. But I think on that process, in terms of the goals and targets, foundations, if you have research and evidence to bring to bear that will help influence what the targets look like, what are the sort of right targets, feasible targets for this agenda, I think that's really helpful. And there are groups that are focused on various goals that you can feed into that are based here in New York. We work on a few issues. We also are sort of a neutral, informed facilitator here. So if there's really good research to bring to bear, we do try to hold a forum or a meeting to highlight those findings or reports. In terms of the other components of the process, so I said there were the goals and targets, there's the financing, and then there's the accountability. If there's some good work among the foundations here on those second two, we can certainly help advise how you then feed into the processes there. And those have a slightly longer timeline.
Okay, thank you very much. At the moment, I do not see any other questions coming through, and we are almost at the end of our time.
Great. Maybe I can just say, so just to highlight a little bit more, so the role of the UN Foundation, as I said, we are here across the street from the UN. I have a whole team tracking the post-2015 process, politics, and content. We are here as neutral, informed facilitators, and sorry, do you want to explain it? No, that's fine. We're here as informed, neutral facilitators to try to help bring member states around to some consensus so that they do have a bold and meaningful outcome at the end of the day, and we don't have that train wreck scenario or the Christmas tree approach that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. And so we bring together countries, we try to introduce new ideas, we try to help inform them about the issues that they'll be negotiating so that they can really negotiate from a position of knowledge and based on evidence. Obviously the politics are going to be very much involved here, but to the extent that we can help the negotiations along with bringing in new ideas, fostering greater engagement and understanding among the countries, we try to do that. Secondly, we really we work to connect outsiders, others to this process, including citizens around the globe. We support some of the UN platforms for bringing inputs from people around the planet, around the globe to this about and how they help improve the situation. Secondly, NGOs and civil society, we do try to connect them to the process. A lot of them come to us for advice on how they influence this. Foundations and in phone calls like this one. Private sector, we are helping to launch a private sector platform to help bring businesses to be engaged in this. And then also experts and think tanks from developing countries. We think they really have a lot of experience in their national context to bring to bear here, and so we try to bring the best of their work to the New York negotiations here and connect them with negotiators from their own countries. And lastly, we serve as a resource. So as I said, we track the negotiations here very closely. We send out a monthly update on where the latest, and the negotiations, the politics, the content, what's coming up, potential areas for or opportunities for influence. And then lastly, we also provide an overview of some of the best research and writing and analyses that's out there. And so those are, I'd say, our three main goals. First is to be a convener and to help shape the agenda. Second is to connect others to this process, and third is to serve as a resource. And so in that, if anyone here needs more information, we're happy to help provide it and to also add you to our list for the monthly updates that we send out.
Thank you very much. As a matter of fact, that was going to be my last question to both of you, if you wanted to explain a little bit more about the role you play in this process, being based also in New York. We will share the short presentation with the participants. And I would also like to take this opportunity to ask you to send me maybe a couple of key links where you're publishing some of the resources you were referring to, so that we can add them to the presentation or add them to the presentation directly, so that people have them immediately as a reference to follow up on. And yeah, we do. I just got a question, very interesting. Can we sign up for the updates? So if you could provide in an additional slide where people can access the resources and how they can sign up for the updates, we will make sure that this goes out together with the presentation. Finally, as mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, this whole journey around the European Foundation Centre's role vis-a-vis the post-2015 process and how we can support our members has been a complex one, because our members have very diverse interests, and most of them don't have the staff capacity to be following very deeply these processes. But one of the things we received as feedback is that our members will find it very useful to actually have exactly this kind of opportunity, briefing opportunities on where we are in the process, what are some of the issues. And so this is the first general update on the process, and we wanted to do it now because we knew that the first set of proposed goals and targets is coming out, so it's also interesting for people to go and take a look at what's going on. We are envisaging follow-up webinars that could be a mix of a general update on where we are in the process, but also much more specific updates around specific goals and targets. That will help those foundations that have, for example, a particular interest in women and girls to get a better grasp of how this discussion is developing and what it might look like, and maybe how they can connect their own data or experience into the process. So we're looking forward to working with the UN Foundation and also other EFC members who are deeply involved in this process